China is in a major crisis. The republic of 1.4 billion people, the nation that is said to be the manufacturing hub of the world, only has oil reserves to last for 80 days. Yeah, you heard that right, 80 days before calamity breaks out. This is not some clickbait guess either. Oh, no. The National Energy Administration, based in Beijing, China, admitted that much themselves. That then put China in a very dangerous position. A position that is resulting in heavy conflicts in the South China Sea. Now, I'm not a betting man, but if a third world war was to start, I would bet that it would break ground in the South China Sea, given all the conflict and trouble China is stirring up there right now.
The South China Sea.
South China Sea.
South China Sea without any kind of deal between governments.
Really raised concerns among some of the neighboring countries that also have claims to the region.
Military aircraft, I'm warning you again. Leave immediately, or you will bear for responsibility.
And Beijing has been issuing warnings to other ships and planes to stay away from these man-made islands.
So what does China having low oil reserves have to do with them fighting a losing war in the South China Sea? Everything. Stay tuned and let me break it down for you. You are about to get your mind blown. I guarantee it. To understand China's current predicament, its oil troubles, plus why it simply cannot afford a world war, we have to start by talking about certain aspects of the People's Republic first. And as with almost all stories about China, it starts with nodding the hat to China's incredible growth over the past decades. Yes, I know, I mention this a lot in my videos, but the truth is, it deserves to be mentioned. Looking at this graph, you can see that the growth that China has undergone these past decades is nothing short of miraculous. Its growth, to some degree, defies logic. And that right there is the part that I will bite into first. China moved from a third world-like country to a global superpower, one that is second only to the United States. This growth came through an evolution that saw China becoming a manufacturing powerhouse that makes anything and everything. So drastic was this growth that in 1980, China contributed just 2.26% to the global GDP. And now, well, China is responsible for almost 19% of the global GDP. I mean, you might not like the nation very much, but it's hard to argue with the progress. This growth, however, came at the stretching of resources and facilities. And that brings us to one of the first key parts of this take, oil and its critical role in China's rise. Back when China was still, well, not as developed as it is today, it was more than capable of taking care of its domestic oil needs. China has several oil fields and wells, and these provided the People's Republic with everything it needed and more. This map can show you the location of several of the oil fields and reserves accessible to the nation. They are found in the provinces, with some being just offshore in the South China Sea. Back in the day, so secure in its oil reserves was China that it actually exported heavily to Japan. Japan has almost no oil fields to tap into, so China, having an abundance, was more than happy to be paid for some of their oil. The problem came close to the turn of the century as manufacturing within the nation started to ramp up, and China underwent what you can call a modern version of the Industrial Revolution. The boom from being largely an agricultural subsistence farming-based country to an industrializing one had a very big shock effect on every single level of the economy. As a nation grew in influence and its citizens became wealthier, the importance of oil only became more highlighted. Despite having massive oil deposits, China's annual oil demand was starting to exceed its annual supply due to excessive domestic demand. This was highlighted further when, in 1993, China produced only 1.2 billion barrels of petroleum, while the nation's demand was at almost 1.7 billion barrels. This led to China becoming a net importer of oil. I mean, look at the deficit back in 1993. There was no way they were going to be able to keep up. Fast forward to today, where China relies heavily on oil to power its fleet of more than 250 million cars, as well as sustain its colossal manufacturing industries, which range from apparel and electronics to automobiles and aircraft. The People's Republic now imports over 75% of its oil from other nations and regions, particularly Africa, the Middle East, Canada, and South America. As it stands, China is the world's largest importer of oil and gas. Something that is befitting given that China is titled the manufacturing hub of the world. You can see that there was no escaping the oil problem from the beginning. China's miraculous growth demanded China's oil dependency at some point. That was the price of China's boom, the price it had to pay for defying the logic of growth. If you're going to build industry and commerce and have explosive growth, you will need the fuel to do that. That was the deal that China had to make with the devil, dependency for advancement. In the present day, China simply cannot run without oil imports. Like I said before, according to this article from Reuters, it's estimated that were China to rely solely on its oil reserves to sustain all 1.4 billion citizens and the industry, they would only have enough to last just about 80 days. Take note of this, because it is a very big deal that has gotten China into a fix. And the reason I will be explaining just why it cannot afford, let alone to win, a third world war. You will need to hear this. But before talking about World War III, I want to make clear that the YouTube algorithm is not happy promoting war-related stuff, as it considers it to be too controversial. So if you can just take a quick second and hit that like button below, it helps me out a lot, since these videos take a long time to make.
China and Taiwan.
China poised to launch a direct attack on Taiwan.
They might be able to launch a war against Taiwan at any time, and we have to defend ourselves.
Videos posted by social media users reportedly show America has fired multiple ballistic missiles during a set of military exercises in the air and the sea.
You have to take the action right now.
Well then, why does any of this have to do with stopping China's war machine if it ever came to that? I'm pretty sure you're all thinking that it obviously has to do with oil, since that's what I've been talking about, and you're right on the money. Now the thought in your mind is, well, the world could stop selling oil to China to stop it from winning a world war. And while that may be correct, it's not as likely. Just as the People's Republic has enemy states, it also has ally states. I'm pretty sure they will have nations still willing to sell them oil. China does have the money and leverage to make that happen, you know? The problem, however, is how the purchased oil and gas will get to them, and how will the oil arrive to the Chinese industries? Answering that question will reveal to us why China is heavily compromised. The truth is, if there has ever been an Achilles heel to China, this is it. China's geographic position can be a bit problematic for them. Most of the oil they import, which remember is 75% of the oil they use, comes from other places like the Gulf states. That means it is transported daily to China. The shortest and most feasible route to get to China is one that passes through the Straits of Malacca, and that is the strait that controls the movement of almost all the oil that gets to China. For those that may not be familiar, the Strait of Malacca is a waterway connecting the Andaman Sea and the South China Sea. It runs between the Indonesian island of Sumatra, peninsular Malaysia, and extreme southern Thailand. The 550-mile-long Malacca Strait, which is actually only 1.7 miles at its narrowest point, links Asia with the Middle East and Europe. This route is so important that about $3.5 trillion, yes, that's trillion with a T, worth of global trade passes through these straits and across the South China Sea every single year. This number includes about 2/3 of China's entire maritime trade volume. Let me say that again for those that missed that part. This one waterway canal that is 1.7 miles at its narrowest point is key in transporting over 66% of all the trade that China does via sea. 15 million barrels of oil pass through these straits every day, with 33% of global liquefied natural gas passing through the gates. As for the oil that is super important for China, well, 60% of those oil needs are met through shipping lines that pass through this strait. If that place does not spell crucial, then I don't know what does. Much to the frustration of China, these straits are not located in Chinese territory, and therefore are not under their direct control. That is where the entire problem begins. The geographical role that the Strait of Malacca plays in the entire Indo-Pacific region cannot be understated. Both the most powerful global superpowers, China and the USA, are dependent on the Strait of Malacca. However, China's dependence is almost a crutch on its ambition now. Because the strait is the shortest sea route between African and Persian Gulf suppliers and their Asian markets, China's import of petroleum from Saudi Arabia reaches the mainland through the Straits of Malacca. The problem now is that because of its importance, this trade route is militarily vulnerable and could endanger Beijing's energy supply were it to be shut off by an enemy state. If you know China, you know they have plenty of those. Let's look at the map once again. Can you see how there are vulnerable choke points? Any tension that might result in military conflict will have the strait used as a battleground. Because most of China's oil comes through this strait, along with a lot of their liquefied natural gas, plus several exports, blocking the strait would be the best option for a siege. Once you cut off China's oil, it becomes a matter of time before they just crumble. Remember this headline we saw earlier? China can only sustain itself for 80 days before it's forced to start rationing oil if we were to assume access to all oil imports is cut off. Oil is an important commodity if a country's economy is to run smoothly. When you factor in the logistical requirements and burdens that war has, having little to no oil is not an option. Everything from the tanks, the ships, the tankers, and planes function on gas and oil derivatives. You simply can't do without them. A simple blockade of the Malaccan Strait will suffice in bending Beijing. And that is why Beijing has been increasing its dominance in the South China Sea. Watching the video in the description will explain the nuances and small details of this that I talked about before. By increasing its dominance in the South China Sea, Beijing seeks to solidify its presence and national security interests, thwarting any opposition to the nation. To this end, the Chinese Navy launched the first aircraft carrier Liaoning in 2016 and the second aircraft carrier in 2017. According to the high officials of the Chinese military, China should have at least 4 active aircraft carriers by 2030, each with a dedicated fleet. You already know where some of these carriers are scheduled to be deployed. It is essential for Beijing to ensure the security of the maritime trade routes in the Indian Ocean and the Straits of Malacca. In addition to trade, which is already a big part, there are military interests too, as the strait is the main route of the Chinese Navy to South and West Asia. Their naval domination in the region is also dependent on that strait. To the People's Republic, consolidating the strait is a simple matter of national security. One would think, but, well, who would dare challenge China like that? After all, China has the world's largest army, and it spends more annually on its army than the Soviet Union used to back in its day. And yes, just so we are clear, that's a lot. About $229.6 billion kind of a lot. No one would dare to mess with such a country, right? Right? Wrong. The one country that would stand in the way of China is the country that spends $801 billion a year on its military budget. It has, stars and stripes on its flag, and it has military and political interests almost everywhere. Maybe you've heard of them. Maybe you've seen the flag somewhere. Yes, folks, I'm talking about the United States. And it would be hard to imagine any version of a world war that would have China and the United States on the same side. In fact, in one of my recent previous videos, I talk about China's grievances with several countries and its border disputes with those nations. Check it out if you haven't, the link will be in the description. Most of those countries in one way or another have the United States as their ally. Along with heavyweights like India, Japan, and Australia, through the ASEAN alliances, 10 other countries are allied with the United States. Other alliances like the AUKUS that consists of the US, Australia, and the UK are also present in the region with heavy firepower. These alliances can easily turn into military ones if and when the need arises. That is not to count Taiwan, which the US is overprotective of for various reasons, microchips in strategic location. So because all these countries have the US at their beck and call, and China-US relationships are not exactly at their best, any conflict in this area can easily drag the US military into it. The US has both motive and means to block the Strait of Malacca and block access to China's imports and exports globally, an action that would force China to attack the US directly to take control of the strait. I know I don't have the best memory, but does anybody remember what happened in 1941 when this Asian country launched a preemptive strike on the US to eliminate indirect ally help and support? Well, let's just say I still remember learning that the effects are not pretty. And decades later, the repercussions are still felt globally. Ask Japan. They unfortunately know what I'm talking about. Now, I've said all of this to say that China is not in a pretty position. Neither with its oil, as it faces a dilemma with the quantities of imports rising, along with unfavorable logistical routes. This oil dependence then leans heavily into why China simply cannot afford a world war. It has geographic handicaps that just make it impossible to sustain a drawn-out war, especially when you factor in the fact that the US and its allies will be involved with their full force. China realizes this, and it has been solidifying relationships elsewhere. At the moment, Beijing-Moscow relationships are at an all-time high, with Putin and Xi Jinping drawing closer by the day. This alliance has the effect of alleviating both nations' problems. For China, it gives them a new source of oil and gas, something that Russia has tons of. Importing more and more from Russia reduces the dependency that China has on the straits and eliminates the risk of losing military confrontations. In the past few years, as China and Russia have solidified their alliance, new oil and gas pipelines directly from Russia to China have been in the works. This is what the end product is supposed to look like. On Russia's end as well, it gives them a reliable market to sell their resources when the world shuns them. Russia seeks to avoid catastrophe to its economy the way it did when Europe introduced restrictions on the buying of Russian oil earlier this year, when the invasion of Ukraine started. So this is a relationship that is supposed to be mutual on both ends, with both parties not just happy about it, but vying for it as well. However, it will be years and years before China's ambition can be safely unhindered by the prospect of a blockade of the Malaccan Strait. Until then, the Asian giant is in, well, quite the pickle. I've also spoken about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is Xi Jinping's modern version of the Silk Road, meant to create new trading routes and stations throughout Asia, with access to Africa and the like. Again, this is Xi Jinping's way of creating more alternative trade routes and creating more partners for imports and export routes that China can control. That way, no one can ever shut them off completely. However, that endeavor has had its setbacks and challenges that we will not dive into right now. It's up to Father Time to determine just how China will manage to wiggle itself out of its oil crisis and out of its fate-bestowed dilemma. As much as I've answered how China can't win a third world war, let's just hope and pray that no war starts at all. Those things have a crazy reputation for being bad for all parties involved. As I've talked about in my previous videos, it's hard covering controversial topics on YouTube. Just recently, YouTube demonetized one of my videos and killed its reach overnight. That doesn't mean I'm going to stop covering these topics, but it definitely sucks losing that income after working so hard on the video. That's why I'm relaunching my Patreon, where viewers can support the videos financially. There's a link in the description. Currently, I have multiple perks for viewers who support my videos, and I plan on regularly adding more perks. Check it all out by clicking on the link in the description.